watching Channel Africa Conversations.
So I argue in my book that had more voices expressed themselves in our time of democratic backsliding, in a time in which our rights and freedoms were being infringed, then we would have been able to arrest the situation much sooner. And so, for example, there was runaway corruption under the previous government. And I argue in my book that perhaps if more voices had been raised to, protest against that corruption, Zambia wouldn't find itself in the crippling debt situation that it is now.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm your host, Peter Ndoro. And today we're joined by a pioneering voice in the African legal and civil society, Linda Kaunda. She's a Zambian lawyer, human rights advocate and civil rights activist. In 2016, she broke new ground by becoming the first woman elected president of the Law Association of Zambia. And in the face of political pressure, gender bias and systemic resistance, she stood firm on the principles of democracy, justice and accountability. And as the founder of Chapter 1 Foundation, Linda has continued to challenge the status quo, defending the rule of law and civic freedoms in Zambia. And this often at great personal risk. Now, through her powerful memoir, Women, Resilience and the Will to Lead, she opens a window into the triumphs and trials that have shaped her life and leadership. She joins us today to reflect on her journey, the battles that she's fought in courtrooms and boardrooms, and her vision for leadership and justice across the African continent. Linda Kaunda, pleasure to have you on Channel Africa Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. The pleasure is all mine. And hello to all the viewers out there.
We've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. We're going to use your book as a vehicle really to talk about your story. And I want to start where the book opens. And that's a powerful recollection of meeting the president at that time. You were only a child, meeting Dr. Kenneth Kaunda. And I wonder what your memory of that moment was about leadership and also power.
Well, when I was growing up in the 80s, during the one-party regime, the president was pretty much all-powerful. And we used to have a saying in vernacular that in heaven there's God and on earth there's Kaunda. And he had an aura about him, an aura of presence and power that was just unmistakable. So when I did meet him, I actually felt that power physically, because I put my hand out to shake his hand, and he put his hand on top of my head and pushed me down until I was in a kneeling position to greet him. So that was my first encounter with Kenneth Kaunda.
Wow, that's quite a thing. I met him much older. Thank goodness he didn't try and get me to kneel down. I actually had a cup of tea with him in his garden, and but he was retired and he was much older. So I do get a sense of what you're saying. Tell me though, in those early years of life, did you get a sense or anything that pointed you to the path that you would follow eventually?
Perhaps in activism, in the sense that I went to secondary school in Swaziland at a school called Waterford Kamhlaba, which was created out of the anti-apartheid movement. So we were very much conscientized about justice and good governance, not only through our teachers, but also through anti-apartheid activists who would come and speak to us. So it was something that was introduced to me at school, but also at home, because when I was growing up towards the end of the 80s, My father and his brother were involved in the movement for multi-party democracy to end the one-party regime in the country. So in that sense, I had many influences.
So tell me a little bit about the kind of support systems, or maybe even lack thereof, that you had as a young woman trying to navigate through these male-dominated spaces that you must have encountered.
I think my greatest support system is definitely my nuclear family. First and foremost, my mother, who has endured much as I've pursued the path of leadership, and my siblings, of course. But when I was elected the first president of the law association, the Bar Association in Zambia, I was pretty much a unicorn. So I didn't really know who to look to help me navigate this path, particularly as a woman in the digital age. Because as you know, women tend to be far more targeted in terms of cyberbullying and all that sort of thing. So I tended to look outwards to people like Oprah Winfrey, and locally in terms of South Africa, Thuli Madonsela, who was a huge influence in terms of the things that she had to go through as public protector in South Africa. And it was pretty much the same path that I was on. So I really looked up to her at that time.
So you talked about the Law Association of Zambia, 2016, a pivotal moment, becoming, as you said, the first female to lead the association. What do you think it meant for women in Zambia, and what did it mean for you personally?
I think a lot of women in Zambia, and maybe let me just start by saying that, like many countries, Zambia is pretty much a patriarchal country in which many people don't subscribe to the view that women are equal to men. And that's both men and women. And so when women challenge those societal norms, it comes with some level of backlash, because you end up doing things that they don't expect from women. So that made my journey a little more difficult. And also, I would say, because we were standing up to the government in terms of good governance, the rule of law, and constitutionalism, there seems to be an impression that, oh, she's just a woman. We can push her around and she'll break and succumb to our will. And that was not the case. That was never my intention. So I did stand up for what we believed in as an association. And ultimately, I believe we were successful in demonstrating to the people of Zambia that we deserve better governance.
You've been described as the Iron Lady. What do you think earned you this title? And also, how did you manage to balance grief on the one hand and also public leadership during the same time?
So the moniker, the Iron Lady, as you know, came from the first female British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, when she was ruling in the 80s and 90s. And I think it came as a result of the first major action that the Law Association of Zambia took after I was elected as president. We had, well, firstly, there was an upcoming general election, and the constitution had been changed a few months prior. And there was an announcement by government that the ministers who were in government would not leave office upon the dissolution of parliament, which occurs 3 months prior to an election, on the basis that the new constitutional amendments gave them that power. And so, as an association, we disagreed with that position because people's positions as members of parliament is dependent on parliament being in session. So if it's dissolved, then the MPs also have to leave office. And so we decided to sue all the ministers and deputy ministers of government in their personal capacities for failing to leave office prior to the election. And we did this in the Constitutional Court. And at the time, people thought we were crazy. I was personally attacked and called legally blonde for daring to believe that we could succeed by suing these ministers. And in fact, so that was in April 2016. When the judgment came out in August 2016, it was in our favor. And the ministers and deputy ministers were made to pay back all their emoluments that they'd been paid during the period that Parliament had been dissolved from their own pockets. So it was a huge victory for the Law Association, and I went from being legally blonde to the Iron Lady, so go figure. In terms of grief, so my first year in office was very challenging. I was expecting at the time that I assumed office, and in the first sort of 5 months of that, I lost my child. And it really, of course, as is normal, was a period of great grief and loss. But it also made me realize as a Zambian woman how the loss of babies in our culture is diminished, in the sense that it's assumed that if you are a childbearing woman, then you can just have another one and move on, and that you should forget about the loss of your child. And so for me, writing about this was very important because I wanted to give voice to the many women out there who are not allowed to grieve the loss of their children on that basis. So that's really one of the reasons I wrote about it. And I also wrote about it in the context of maternal and child mortality in my country, which is very high. I can't recall the statistics at the moment, but it's quite shocking. And I attribute it to the fact that the loss of babies due to the high fertility rate, it's assumed people will just churn out more babies, so it doesn't matter. So I thought I'd write about this instance in order to bring light to the issue of improving maternal and child mortality in my country.
And you know, you remind me of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, I think it was, who had a baby whilst she was in office. And it's almost impossible to think of that being possible, particularly on our continent, because as we're talking, one often views women and their situation. You're either going to be a mother or you're going to be a leader. You can't have both. And she showed that it could be done. And I wonder if that's a message that comes through then in your experience.
Well, perhaps if I'd had a happier end to that story. But one thing I did write about in the book was the fact that when I was going through the election period to be elected as president of the Bar Association, I had to hide the fact that I was pregnant because I didn't believe that a woman would be elected in my position. And I think that's a story that many women can identify with, not just in terms of some kind of political office, but even in employment, because women tend to be discriminated against on the basis of pregnancy.
Did you ever feel that you needed to lead differently because you were a woman? And also, did you feel ever that you had to prove yourself more than men just to be seen as an equal?
I tend to find that it's more difficult for women to be seen as a good leader. their qualifications are diminished, their skills are diminished, as compared to men. And I read something by the psychologist Adam Grant recently, and he commented on a social media post that when men are faced with a woman with the title doctor, as in having a doctorate, they would refer to that woman by her first name, as opposed to her being Dr. So-and-so. And so in the test that was run, 100% of the women, of the men did that. But only, I think it was 40 or 50% of women did that to their fellow women. They would refer to her more likely as a doctor. So there's just a lack of respect, I think, for the contributions and skills of women. And it doesn't matter how qualified you are, how much you've contributed in terms of your leadership. There's still a feeling that men ultimately are better than you. And I think I've noted that during my election campaign as last president. So, for example, some people who were approached by my campaign team said things like, doesn't Linda know that men are supposed to be in charge? Why is she going for president as well as being a named partner? And doesn't she read the Bible? This is the natural order of things, that men should be in charge. So there's still a lot of patriarchy out there. And I think it's very telling that in the, excuse me, in the 8 years since I was elected, actually it's 9 this year, there hasn't been another woman who's followed me. And it's something that I really advocate for, because what we don't want is the door to be shut firmly behind me. One hopes that their legacy is that people can see that women can do the job and will be more likely to be elected as a result.
Tell me a little bit more about Chapter One Foundation and why it was important for you to found it, and why it's fulfilling for you that you march through the challenges that it often presents, I'm sure.
I started Chapter One Foundation after I stepped down as president of the Law Association of Zambia, because I felt at the time we were marching towards the reintroduction of a sort of autocratic state. And the then party in government was still in office. And so I thought, my work is not done here. So I created this NGO to promote and protect human rights, the rule of law, constitutionalism, and good governance through strategic and public interest litigation, through advocacy work, and through civic education. And I think to a great extent, Chapter One has fulfilled all its intended purposes and is still standing, even though I've stepped down. And so that's a great attribute or a tribute to the team for keeping on. But essentially, we work with other civil society organizations to push back on the shrinking civic space in our country.
Yeah, shrinking civic space, that's my next thought, actually. Zambia, like many countries across the continent, have been grappling with democratic decline, issues such as tribalism. How do you think society can push back? You talk about civic education. What do we teach society about their ability to take back their power?
Absolutely. This is something I talk about in my book in terms of what I call the cost of silence. So I argue in my book that had more voices expressed themselves in our time of democratic backsliding, in a time in which our rights and freedoms were being infringed, then we would have been able to arrest the situation much sooner. And so, for example, there was runaway corruption under the previous government. And I argue in my book that perhaps if more voices had been raised to, protest against that corruption, Zambia wouldn't find itself in the crippling debt situation that it is now. And it's sad to say, but we're in a very similar situation now under the new government, which I'm afraid is exhibiting many of the unfortunate traits of stifling human rights and even corruption that we faced under the previous regime. And so I think my book is relevant now because people have seen the pattern. They can see what's happening. For example, now we're grappling with new cybersecurity and cybercrimes laws. We're grappling with an impending journalism bill, an impending NGO bill, CCTV monitoring. There's so many things that unfortunately are trending in the wrong direction.
You have a very interesting theme, leadership under fire. Let's talk a little bit about that. In the chapter titled Impeachment, you talk about smear campaigns and public attacks. I wonder how you manage your emotions and continue to lead during such difficult times.
I must confess that the way I managed to move through that period was simply through powering through. And I didn't, unfortunately, process my emotions very well, and subsequently ended up with burnout, which I also talk about in my book. But perhaps that was the best I could do at the time with what I knew. I think that at the time that was a time when I had to demonstrate strength, because everyone was looking up to me. The ruling government was threatening to dissolve the Bar Association in Zambia because we're created by statute, and they were threatening to repeal the statute that creates the Bar Association. And so when everyone around me was feeling, apprehensive, I had to be calm to sort of steady the ship. And I think that to a large extent it worked, because the threat was removed. The Bar Association is still very much there, and it's very vibrant. And we managed to negotiate our way out of that crisis. So I think there was a feeling, as I mentioned earlier, that women can be intimidated into doing the bidding of people who wield power. And so for me, it was really important to stand up to that bullying.
You've experienced quite a bit, a lot of it pioneering, and as you said earlier, many instances where you had no one to look for or to look to assist because they just hadn't been on the path you were walking. Do you think mentorship then is really, really important, particularly for women in leadership, in law, and even civil society?
Absolutely. And in fact, I, together with the now Judge Bubile Shonga, created the first mentorship program for the Bar Association in Zambia. It's something that is extremely close to my heart. And in my own private sphere, I do try and mentor as many women as I can, because I believe that, demonstrating how to maneuver the path is the best way to support someone in their journey.
Let's talk a little bit more about the book. What was the most difficult chapter for you to write, and why?
It was writing about the loss of my child, because that was very personal. And it was a very traumatic ordeal, as many women might know, because so often it's assumed that when you are pregnant, you will deliver a healthy child. And that was my first experience with something that was completely unexpected. So again, it was important for me to show that vulnerability because many women are silenced around that issue.
I'm going to talk again about this vulnerability thing because I am fearful that when women show vulnerability, it's interpreted as weakness. Is that something that you think about?
For sure. In the book, I talk about how during the period that I was Bar Association president and even beyond, there was a point at which I lost the ability to cry because it was just too painful. And I also knew that if I ever did cry in public, it would be a disaster. And so there was this pressure to kind of maintain a veneer of strength at all times, which I suppose men and women have to demonstrate as leaders. But I'm not advocating for showing your weaknesses. Like I said, there's a time and place for everything. But I think it was just important for me to tell my story in a way that shows that it's not all a bed of roses.
Yeah, you talk about men also should be showing their vulnerabilities. And in fact, we don't do that well at all. And that plays out in the high suicide rates that men show compared to women. The book is titled Women, Resilience, and the Will to Lead. What's the one lesson that you hope that your readers will walk away from after reading this book?
I think the main lesson that I want people to walk away with is that both men and women deserve a seat at the table. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my book, it's important because there's a diversity of thought within each gender. We're not all the same. Not all men are the same. Not all women are the same. And so when we talk about representation, we don't just mean having one woman at the table, because that doesn't represent the diversity of thought within the gender. So we need, what I advocate for is equality, or at the very least equity between the genders, so that it will enrich the conversations that we have to give us better tools to resolve the challenges that we face as a society or as a nation. And actually, at the beginning of my book, I give a demonstration of how that works. I talk about a story told by a previous Swedish foreign minister on the BBC. And she told a story about two warring factions who were fighting over a river on a map. And at the time, there were just men involved in the conversation. And when they finally introduced women to the table, the woman pointed out that the river on the map had in fact dried up many years ago. And they knew that because they were responsible for drawing water and for cooking and maintaining the household. And if they hadn't had that perspective, they would have continued fighting. So that's just one demonstration of why it's important to have a diversity of thought in any situation.
And perhaps a thought about the continent at large, your country, Zambia. What gives you hope for the future of your country and the continent at large going forward?
What gives me hope about the continent is always its people, and particularly my compatriots in Zambia. We are one of the outliers on the continent in terms of the fact that we choose who governs us. And if we don't like how they're governing us, we will change them. And that has been true over time since we reverted back to multipartism in 1991. And I have every confidence that the people of Zambia know how they want to be governed and will do what is necessary to ensure that they get the government that they deserve.
And then perhaps finally, the next memoir. What's going to be in those chapters? What's next for you?
Well, I may not write another memoir, but I would like to write another book. And I have to say that nonfiction is my genre, about how women should dare to fail. Because so often women either self-censure or they self-sabotage along their leadership journeys. And I want to write something that gives them the courage to know that they are enough as they pursue whatever they would like to do in their lives.
I have no doubt that it's going to be successful and as inspiring as this current book. Linda Kasonde, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so, so much indeed for joining us on Channel Africa Conversations.
Thank you, Peter. It's been an absolute delight.
Zikomo kwambiri. And that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. Thanks so much indeed for tuning in. Before I go, a reminder, we really would love to hear from you. We'd like to hear what your thoughts are on what you've just watched, the conversation that we've just had, and also tell us the kind of conversations that you want us to have and with who. And you can contact us on our social media pages that are on your screen now. And in fact, you can start right away and comment in the comment section below this video. Until the next time, thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.